Dawn from Patchwork and Poodles, and today we are going to learn variations on big stitch hand binding. If you haven't yet watched my big stitch hand binding video, make sure to check that out first because I cover supplies and how-to for traditional big stitch hand binding, that big chunky stitch. This video is going to cover two different variations that you can do once you've already mastered big stitch hand binding. We're going to cover the modified blanket stitch as well as the X's. So let's get started. All right, we're going to cover big stitch binding variations, the modified blanket stitch and the X's. Let's start with the modified blanket stitch. If you haven't watched Hand Binding 101, be sure to do that because I cover all the basics that you need to know to be able to be successful in big stitch hand binding in that video, and then as well to be able to be successful big stitch hand binding these additional designs. I'm going to leave this up here for reference. I'm going to grab the piece that I'm going to be binding. It's already been prepped, and I'm going to start the same way that I would with regular big stitch hand binding. I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to bring it through the back of the quilt, not going through the front, about the length of my needle, and pull. So just like we did in that other video, we're going to start the same exact way. So my thread's right about here. I'm going to have it come up through the binding about 1/8 of an inch away from the end of the binding. Okay, so now we're ready to start our stitch. I'm going to bring my needle straight down right below where it is in my binding. So straight down, angling your needle so that it's going to come up right next to where your thread is right now. So if you think about it, it's going to come down here, it's going to make that nice straight stitch, and it's going to come up to the left, allowing me to make that following stitch. We always want to make sure our needle's not coming up through the front. And we're going to pull. My thread's a little long. Just don't like having to get a new piece of thread, so I like to make it extra long. Okay, so now we're right next to it. Again, same thing. We're going to bring our needle straight down below where our thread currently is, angling it to the left so that it's going to come up right next to it, making sure that it's not poking through to the front. And stitch. I'm going to continue in this manner. So I would continue this way all the way across my quilt top. Again, trying to make sure that it doesn't show up on the front. We're really just trying to capture the back of the quilt when we're making our stitches. So this is the motion that we're going for, but obviously we're trying to capture that binding as well. So you could continue stitching like this all the way across your quilt. Now let's look at how to make X's. For both these designs, I start and I stop the same way that I do for traditional or big stitch hand binding, so big, running stitches. I always start a little bit away from where I want to begin. I always end by moving my needle away from my binding and then making my knots. So all of the basics that we went through on Big Stitch Hand Binding 101, they all apply here. We're just doing a different design on our binding. All right, so to start our binding of X's, we're going to start about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. That's where our needle and our thread is going to come up. The design that we're going to do is that we're going to stitch from here up. We're going to travel between the layers so we end up again at the top, but on the top right, and then top right to bottom left. So it's going to make an X. This design requires you to kind of tip your quilt top a little bit, different directions to be able to maneuver your needle. So just be aware, I'll be twisting and pulling to make sure that I can get that perfect stitch. So with our needle down here, we're going to bring it up top left through the layers to come up top right. I'm not going through all the way to the front, but I am capturing that backing in my stitch. And pull. Top right to bottom left. And then I'm going to bring my needle in and come out about 1/8 of an inch away right next to it. So that's one X. My needle is perfectly positioned to start the next one. So again, I'm going to twist it a little bit, bring it down and across, making sure that I'm not going all the way to the front, and then down and across. For these flag placemats, I've decided to do X's around where the blue is, and the little lines around where all the red is, echoing the stars and the stripes. You could also decide that you want to do these designs as little decorative spots within your binding. So for example, these X's would be really fun to just have the amount that I have here, and then go back to my normal running stitch binding. It would just add a little bit extra touch that if you're looking on the back, all of a sudden you see these really cute little X's in different spots. Same thing with the modified blanket stitch. That would also look really nice as an additional design element within the back of your binding. So those are the two modified blanket stitch and big X's that you can choose to do on the back of your binding as an alternative to big stitch hand binding. If you've already done big stitch hand binding and you want to try something else, I recommend you try one of these. They're really fun and they add a really nice touch to the back of your quilt. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe, and if you want me to cover a different topic in the future, be sure to add it to the comments below.